The November rain drummed against the Gothic windows of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C., where America's elite had gathered to honor Senator Robert Harrison's life. Black limousines lined the street like a funeral procession of power, their polished surfaces reflecting the gray autumn sky. Inside, the cathedral's vaulted ceilings echoed with hushed conversations between politicians, military brass, and society's upper echelon. At the cathedral's imposing front steps, Frank Martinez stood in the drizzle, his weathered hands clutching a crumpled program. His faded army jacket, decorated with patches from forgotten conflicts, hung loose on his thin frame. Gray stubble covered his hollow cheeks, and his boots, polished but clearly old, showed the wear of a man who had walked many difficult miles. The security guards at the entrance eyed him with barely concealed disdain. "Sir, this is a private service," announced Officer Peterson, a young man in a crisp uniform who couldn't have been more than 25. His partner, Officer Williams, stepped closer, hand resting on his radio. "I'm going to need to see your invitation." Frank reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, producing a dog-eared photograph instead of the expected embossed invitation. "I don't have one of those fancy cards," he said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and desert dust. "But I knew Bobby Harrison. We served together." Peterson barely glanced at the photograph. "Look, buddy, we get a lot of people claiming they knew the senator. This service is for family and dignitaries only. You can pay your respects at the public memorial tomorrow." Before continuing, give this video a like and subscribe to hear more stories about heroes whose true valor isn't always recognized by those who should know better. Inside the cathedral, the organ began its solemn prelude. Frank could see through the open doors rows of distinguished mourners in expensive black attire, military officers with chests full of ribbons, and politicians whose faces graced newspaper headlines. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the weight of importance. "Please," Frank said, stepping forward. "Bobby saved my life in Vietnam. I just want to say goodbye." Williams moved to block his path. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Step away from the entrance or we'll have to escort you from the premises." Frank's weathered face remained calm, but something flickered in his dark eyes, not anger, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this moment. He looked past the guards at the gathering inside, where Senator Harrison's flag-draped coffin lay surrounded by flowers that probably cost more than Frank's monthly disability check. The rain intensified, soaking through Frank's jacket and plastering his gray hair to his forehead. Other late arrivals hurried past him, flashing their invitations like tickets to an exclusive show. A group of lobbyists in designer suits brushed by, one of them muttering something about homeless people ruining the dignity of the service. Frank took a step back, water pooling at his feet. He'd faced enemy fire, buried friends in foreign soil, and survived wars that most of these people only read about in history books. But standing here, rejected by guards young enough to be his grandchildren, he felt every one of his 73 years. "I understand," he said quietly, tucking the photograph back into his jacket. "I'll wait over there." He moved to a bench across the street, where he sat with military posture despite the rain soaking through his clothes. From there, he watched the cathedral's entrance, his eyes never leaving the doorway where power and privilege had gathered to mourn a man they thought they knew completely. Frank sat motionless on the wet bench, watching the steady stream of VIPs entering the cathedral. Each arrival was announced by the subtle choreography of importance, limousines pulling up precisely to the curb, umbrellas appearing as if by magic, and the guards' respectful nods as invitations were presented. The contrast between their treatment and his own rejection stung more than the cold rain seeping through his jacket. His mind drifted back 47 years to a sweltering jungle in Southeast Asia, where Robert Harrison wasn't a senator, but a scared 19-year-old private from Connecticut, whose father had pulled strings to get him assigned to a supply unit far from the front lines. Frank remembered their first meeting at Firebase Charlie. Bobby had been crying behind the mess tent, homesick and terrified, clutching a letter from his girlfriend back home. First time away from home, Frank had asked, offering the kid his sea rations. At 26, Frank was ancient by Vietnam standards, a career soldier who'd volunteered for his third tour because the Army was the only family he'd ever known. Bobby had looked up with tears streaming down his baby face. "I don't belong here. My dad thinks this will make a man out of me, but I'm not cut out for this." Frank had sat down beside him in the red dirt. "Nobody's cut out for war, kid. We just do what we have to do." That conversation had been the beginning of an unlikely friendship. While other soldiers mocked Bobby's privileged background and obvious fear, Frank took the young man under his wing. He taught him how to clean his rifle properly, how to spot the signs of incoming mortars, and most importantly, how to find courage when everything inside you was screaming to run. Across the street, Frank watched Senator Harrison's son and daughter emerge from a black sedan. They looked exactly like their father had at their age, confident, entitled, moving through the world as if it owed them deference. Frank wondered if Bobby had ever told them about Firebase Charlie, about the night everything changed. It had been during the Tet Offensive when their supposedly safe supply base came under heavy attack. Frank remembered the chaos, rockets screaming overhead, the ammunition dump exploding in brilliant orange flame, and soldiers running in every direction. In the confusion, Bobby had become separated from his unit and found himself pinned down by sniper fire near the perimeter. Frank had been ordered to fall back with the others, but when he realized Bobby was missing, he'd gone back. He found the young soldier huddled behind a destroyed truck, paralyzed with fear as bullets sparked off the metal around him. "I can't move," Bobby had whispered. "I'm sorry, Frank, I'm a coward." "Courage isn't about not being scared," Frank had told him, pulling out his sidearm and checking the ammunition. "It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified." Frank had provided covering fire while Bobby crawled to safety, taking a bullet in his shoulder that ended his military career. The wound had never healed properly, leaving him with chronic pain that made steady employment nearly impossible. But he'd never regretted those few minutes of heroism that saved a frightened rich kid who would go on to become one of the most respected senators in American history. The irony wasn't lost on him now, sitting in the rain while that same man's funeral proceeded without him. Bobby had indeed become a great man by most measures. He'd served his country with distinction in the Senate, championed veterans' causes, and built a reputation for integrity that spanned decades. But somewhere along the way, he'd apparently forgotten the grizzled sergeant who'd risked everything to bring him home. Frank pulled out the photograph again, protecting it from the rain with his jacket. It showed two soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the war raging around them. Bobby looked impossibly young, while Frank appeared weathered even then. On the back, in Bobby's careful handwriting, were the words, "To the best friend a scared kid ever had, I'll never forget what you did for me." Our age. But apparently, he had forgotten. The rain had intensified into a proper Washington downpour when a convoy of military vehicles approached St. Matthew's Cathedral. Frank looked up from his bench, water dripping from his chin, as a black sedan with four-star flags pulled up to the entrance. The security guards immediately snapped to attention, their earlier casual demeanor replaced by crisp military bearing. From the sedan emerged General Patricia Coleman, her uniform immaculate despite the weather. At 62, she commanded respect through presence alone, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture reflecting decades of military discipline, and her chest adorned with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple conflicts. An aide appeared with an umbrella, but she waved him off, preferring to walk through the rain with the same stoicism she'd shown in desert heat and mountain cold. Officer Peterson practically saluted as she approached. "Good afternoon, General Coleman. Welcome to—" "Where's your command post?" she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Ma'am, your security command post. I need to review the guest list immediately." Peterson looked confused. General, is there a security concern? We've screened everyone according to protocol. General Coleman's gray eyes swept the cathedral entrance, then fixed on something across the street. Frank, still sitting on his bench in the rain, felt her gaze but didn't look up. He'd learned long ago that eye contact with superior officers usually led to trouble for men like him. "Sergeant Martinez," she called out, her voice carrying across the street despite the rain and traffic noise. Frank's head snapped up in surprise. Across the street, General Coleman stood in the downpour, pointing directly at him. "Get over here, now." The security guards looked bewildered as Frank slowly stood, his joints protesting after sitting in the cold rain. He crossed the street with the measured pace of an old soldier, his back straight despite the pain. As he approached, Peterson moved to intercept him. "Sir, I told you before." "Stand down, officer," General Coleman commanded. "This man is with me." She studied Frank's face with the intensity of someone reading a crucial intelligence report. "Frank Martinez, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam 1968 to 1970. 3 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with V device, and the Distinguished Service Cross for actions at Firebase Charlie during the Tet Offensive." Frank blinked in surprise. "You know my service record." "I know more than that." General Coleman turned to the stunned security guards. "This man saved the life of Senator Robert Harrison in Vietnam. He took a bullet doing it, and that wound ended his military career. He spent the last 50 years working maintenance jobs and living on disability, while the man he saved became one of the most powerful politicians in America." Officer Peterson's face had gone pale. "General, we had no way of knowing." "You had every way of knowing if you'd bothered to ask instead of judging him by his appearance." She looked back at Frank, her expression softening slightly. "The senator put your name on the guest list personally. He also requested that you be seated in the front row with the family." Frank stared at her, rain streaming down his face. "I don't understand." "The guard said I wasn't invited." General Coleman's jaw tightened as she turned back to Peterson. "Did this man show you identification?" He showed us a photograph, but you assumed that a man in an old army jacket couldn't possibly belong at a senator's funeral." Her voice could have cut steel. "Did you check the guest list against his name?" Peterson's silence was answer enough. "Frank Martinez was more than invited to this service," General Coleman continued. "He was specifically requested by Senator Harrison's family to serve as an honorary pallbearer. The senator spoke about him frequently, called him the bravest man he'd ever known." The general's aide approached with a tablet, showing Frank's name prominently displayed on the VIP guest list, marked with a special notation indicating his status as an honored guest. Frank felt his knees weaken. Bobby remembered. "He never forgot," General Coleman said gently. "He talked about you in his final weeks, said he owed his entire life to a sergeant who showed him what real courage looked like." Inside the cathedral, Frank found himself guided to the front row, where Senator Harrison's family waited. The warmth hit him immediately after hours in the cold rain, and several people offered him towels and a dry jacket. Bobby's son, Michael, approached with tears in his eyes. "You must be Frank Martinez," Michael said, extending his hand. "Dad talked about you all the time. He said you were the reason he learned how to be brave." Frank shook the young man's hand, still in shock. "Your father was already brave. He just needed to find it." "He established a scholarship fund in your honor," Bobby's daughter Sarah added, joining them. "Full college scholarships for children of disabled veterans. He wanted to tell you himself, but—" She gestured toward the flag-draped coffin, unable to finish the sentence. General Coleman had taken a seat nearby, and Frank noticed other high-ranking officers nodding respectfully in his direction. Word had spread quickly through the gathering about the old soldier who'd been turned away at the door. The shame on the security guards' faces was evident as they realized the magnitude of their error. "Frank," came a familiar voice. He turned to see Admiral James Burke, now in his 80s but still sharp-eyed. "Jesus Christ, Martinez, I heard those idiots tried to keep you out. Frank recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Burke from Firebase Charlie, one of the young officers Frank had helped train. Jimmy, Admiral Burke. That's right, and I never forgot what you taught us about leadership under fire. Burke's voice carried throughout the nearby pews. This man didn't just save Senator Harrison's life. He saved mine, too, and probably a dozen others. He was the backbone of that unit. Other voices began to join in. Colonel Patricia West, retired, approached with her husband, Sergeant Martinez. You probably don't remember me, but you helped evacuate my unit during the Tet offensive. I was Lieutenant Patricia Hendricks then. More people came forward, former soldiers whose lives Frank had touched, their children and grandchildren who existed because of his actions, and current military leaders who'd heard the stories passed down through the ranks. Each introduction revealed another layer of Frank's forgotten heroism, another life he'd saved or shaped without seeking recognition. Senator Harrison's widow, Elena, approached with slow, dignified steps. At 78, she moved with the grace of someone who'd spent decades as a political spouse, but her eyes held genuine warmth as she took Frank's weathered hands in her soft ones. "Frank," she said simply, "Bobby never stopped talking about you. He tried to find you so many times over the years." Frank's throat constricted. "I moved around a lot, never stayed in one place long." He blamed himself for losing touch. Said it was the biggest regret of his life, not being able to thank the man who gave him everything. Elena's voice broke slightly. "He wanted you to know that every good thing he did in the Senate, every veteran he helped, every battle he fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves, it all started with the lesson you taught him in Vietnam." The organ music swelled as the service was about to begin, but Frank found himself surrounded by a circle of respect he'd never expected. General Coleman stood and addressed the gathering in a voice that carried to every corner of the cathedral. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin this service, I want you to understand something about the man sitting in the front row. Sergeant Frank Martinez embodies everything noble about military service. He gave his all for his country and his fellow soldiers, asking nothing in return. He saved lives, shaped leaders, and showed courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet he lived in obscurity, while those he saved rose to greatness." She paused, her eyes sweeping the assembled crowd of Washington's power elite. "Today, we don't just honor Senator Harrison. We honor the man who made Senator Harrison possible. We honor every forgotten hero who stands in the shadows while others bask in the light they helped create." As the funeral service concluded, Frank found himself at the center of something he'd never experienced in his 73 years: recognition. Not the hollow kind that comes with ceremonies and speeches, but the deep, meaningful acknowledgement from people whose lives he'd touched without ever realizing it. Outside the cathedral, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the breaking clouds. Frank stood with the other pallbearers, his weathered hands helping to carry his old friend to his final rest. As they loaded the coffin into the hearse, Elena Harrison approached him one final time. "Bobby left something for you," she said, pressing an envelope into his hands. He updated it every few years, hoping someday he'd get to deliver it personally. Frank opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter in Bobby's familiar handwriting, along with documents he couldn't immediately comprehend. As he read, tears began to stream down his cheeks. "Frank, if you're reading this, then I've passed on without finding you, which breaks my heart. I've spent 50 years trying to locate the man who saved my life and taught me what it means to serve others. Every search came up empty, but I never stopped hoping. You probably don't know that I kept track of your service record, your injuries, and your struggles after the war. I know about the chronic pain, the difficulty finding steady work, and the pride that kept you from asking for help. I also know that you never once complained or sought recognition for what you did. I've established a trust fund in your name. The enclosed documents transfer ownership to you. It's enough to ensure you never want for anything again. But more than that, I've created the Martinez Foundation for Forgotten Heroes designed to help veterans like you who gave everything and asked for nothing. I need you to know that everything good I accomplished in my life stemmed from that moment in Firebase Charlie when you showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. Every bill I passed, every veteran I helped, every stand I took for justice was built on the foundation you gave me that night. You didn't just save my life, Frank, you taught me how to live it. Forever in your debt, Bobby Harrison. Frank's knees gave out, and he sat heavily on the cathedral steps, the letter shaking in his hands. General Coleman sat beside him, offering silent support as he processed the magnitude of what he'd just learned. The trust fund is worth $8 million, she said quietly. The foundation has been operating for 20 years, helping thousands of veterans. He was waiting to tell you about it himself. Around them, the gathering began to disperse, but many stopped to shake Frank's hand, to share their own stories of how his actions had rippled through their lives. Admiral Burke lingered, his own eyes wet with tears. You taught us that real heroes don't wear capes, Burke said. They wear worn-out boots and faded jackets, and they do what needs doing without expecting parades. As the crowd thinned, Frank found himself alone with Alina Harrison. She sat beside him on the steps, and together they watched the Washington traffic resume its normal pace, as if the world hadn't just revealed one of its hidden heroes. What happens now? Frank asked. Now you get to choose, Alina replied. Bobby always said you never got the retirement you deserved. The trust fund ensures you'll be comfortable, but more importantly, the foundation needs leadership from someone who understands what these forgotten veterans face. Frank looked at the documents in his hands, then at the city spreading out before them. For 50 years, he'd believed his service had been forgotten, his sacrifices meaningless. But Bobby Harrison had never forgotten. He'd spent decades trying to repay a debt that Frank had never expected to collect. He didn't need to do this, Frank said finally. Yes, he did, Alina replied, because that's the kind of man you helped him become.